Hmm.
Okay, everybody, I'd like to welcome you to our Mass Bay RE's third Thursday online. We've got an interesting program tonight. Larry Mills will be showing us a variety of photographs of steam locomotives operating in Germany in the early 1970s. So before we get started, just a couple of brief announcements about upcoming programs. We're going to be doing our programs via Zoom remotely for the foreseeable future. We're working on setting up our meeting room at the Union Church for internet capability. So at some point when we are able to go back there, we'll also be able to live stream. So anyway, coming up next month on March 18th, Amtrak's Chris Jagodzinski, who's the Assistant VP for Operations, is going to be doing a presentation on the testing preparation and launch of the new Acela 21, the trains that will be replacing the now 25 years old, I think, legacy Acela sets. So that should be a real interesting program. That's Thursday, March 18th. On Thursday, April 15th, Ben Clark is going to be doing his presentation on the trials and tribulations and occasional triumphs of a New Hampshire short line railroader on Zoom. The board has determined that we don't really think we can do a live dinner in the depot in April and be confident that people will be safe. Thought of putting 70 people into that meeting room under the current conditions, or even conditions as they may be then, is not too promising. So we're going to do Ben's program remotely rather than postpone him further. We are planning to do a dinner in the depot probably in October, when hopefully things will be back to normal, with a speaker to be determined at some future time.
Oh, Dave?
Yeah.
Dave? May 20th. If you still have it open, is going to be Laura Katz-Smith?
I already booked Andrew Jennings for a program on Japanese railways then.
Oh, okay.
I neglected to send you a message, so.
Laura will, I'm sure she seems like she'd be flexible, so we'll get together about dates.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
So anyway, without further ado, we'll get things rolling here. And as I said, our presenter tonight is Larry Mills. Larry's been an RRE member since 1982. He grew up in Brookline, graduated from Boston State College in 1970, and spent 3 years in the U.S. Army stationed in Germany. He'll tell us a little bit more about that. Had the good fortune to be there at a time when there were a lot of steam locomotives still operating in Germany. And so Larry was an officer of the Federal Protective Service until his retirement in 2015. So Larry, it is all yours.
All righty. Okay.
Larry's program is divided into 4 segments, and
All righty.
so,
I'll begin with a map of the first section I want to show. I was stationed in the town of Hanau. From the time I arrived there on the 18th of January of 1972 until the 1st of November, when I was transferred to Frankfurt to work in the IG Farben building, which was the headquarters of the 5th Corps, which I was under. At the time, the Farben building, as you may or may not know, was the headquarters of IG Farben. They're kind of famous for something rather unpleasant, namely Zyklon B. But for some reason, and there's been a lot of debate about it, when Frankfurt was bombed into the ground, the Farben building was never touched, even though it was on the edge of town. And right after the war, it became the headquarters of General Eisenhower. fact, I had a cousin who was stationed in there at the time as part of. Hello? So I was, later they moved the USRA headquarters in 1948 to Heidelberg, and 5th Corps took the Harvard building, and 7th Corps was based out of Stuttgart, and that was your Army in Europe. Well, anyways, this first section I'm going to show is going to be running south and east. Now, if you look at the map where Frankfurt is, you'll see Hanau. And just down a little to the southeast of Hanau is Aschafenberg. Now, Frankfurt at that time was completely electric, except for a limited diesel operation, as was Hanau. But Aschafenberg still had steam. So it was fairly close and easy to get to, so I'll start with that. On Thanksgiving Day of 1972 was our holiday, but not theirs, so they had rush hour traffic. So I went down to Aschafenberg to see what was going on, and I was not disappointed. And into town comes a tank engine with a few pre-war cars. And the way it worked at the time was the train would come out from Frankfurt, and they'd have a motive power change at Aberg, and the tank engine would take it the rest of the way down one of the more local branches. So I had a chance to see that. And here you see on the engine change taking place. That juice jack had just brought a train out from, was ready to take the train on into Frankfurt, and the tank engine had just disconnected. And here's the tank engine. I had to take a time exposure. It's getting a little late. When I was a little kid, and it must have been March, April of 1950, I was walking, holding onto my stroller while my father was pushing it into Brookline Village, and my sister called out, "There's a train in the station." I looked between the buildings, and there was a D1A pulling outbound. And that was my first view of a steam engine, and my first view and my only view of a tank engine until I was over here. I wish I could have seen more of them, but of course that was right at the time when the RS3s were taking over the Highland branch, which I saw in its evolution in the following years. I had my first train ride on that, both in turtleback cars behind RS3s and my first Bud car ride in 1955 as well. And of course, I was a witness to the conversion of the line in 1958 and 9, which is a story you all know. Anyways, Aberg was an interesting place, and while I was there was a 50. Now the 50 is what they call Kriegslokes. And if you're familiar with German steam, and one of the best books available was Ron Ziel's book, Steel Rails to Victory. It came out about 50 years ago. It had a pretty good description of the Kriegslok series, and the 50s were 51s and 2s were of that series. And basically what they were lightweight engines designed to be run over almost any clearance in Europe, to be regauged very quickly. So if they went into Russia, they could regauge them fast, which they did. And when I was over there was still a lot of them running. It seems kind of weird. I mean, we bombed the hell out of German railways, and there's all the war engines running around, and our steam was long gone. But I use that to my advantage. Of course, they were used for some rather evil things at one time, supplying the Vermont and carrying human cargoes to unpleasant places, but they also rebuilt Germany under the Marshall Plan, and they were pulling American troop trains when I was over there. In fact, one not particularly a lucky passenger was my father-in-law, was a POW in the Battle of Bulge. Anyways, this is another shot in Aberg of a 103. They were at that time, the fastest juice jacks in Germany. Of course, they've got newer stuff now. And it's passing a deadline of 65 class tank engines. Those were built in the 50s, but they were rapidly being phased out. And there's a deadline of 3 of them sitting there, as you can see. You did see deadlines of steam engines in a number of places over there at that time because conversions were taking place. And of course, as I had mentioned earlier, the policy of the DB was never to buy more diesels than they would need for lines never to be electrified. And since they hadn't finished electrification, they still had plenty of steam. So that meant for plenty of good hunting. Now, one day when I was over there, my buddy, Doug Rhodes, who happened to be going over to Germany in the same flight I was, he was from Ohio. And we happened to get to talking, and I find out by saying the word juice jack, he was a rail fan. So he was stationed at my concern. So we took lots of trips together all over the place for the next few months. He came home in January of 73. I was there till June. And we were riding down to Wurzburg one day, and we went through Gemunden and saw a couple of 50s sitting there with smoke coming out of them. So we stopped by another time, and did a little photography. And there, that's what we saw. You notice they have brakeman housing on the back of some of them. The little shunt engine there on the front. You'd see those in different places for use for light freight switching and perhaps shop movements. Now we go down to Wurzburg. Wurzburg, and a friend of my sister's lived there, so we went down, paid them a visit, and while I was down there, I noticed there was quite a bit of steam activity. And the first engines we saw were these 23 class 262s. They were designed in 1940, but none of them were built until 1950, so they're all younger than me. And they turned out to be the last new steam engines built in Germany in 1959. I think 105 of them were built. They're very similar in character and use to the 102 Pacifics the CPR had that were built beginning in 1944 that are still on tourist railroads at places. I know Steamtown had 127 and there were others over the years. And they were used on a lot of local service when I was there. There's about 7 or 8 of them still preserved, and I know at least one of them does special trips. Fan trips in Germany are still reasonably frequent, and if any of you happen to have YouTube, you can click them up. So I saw a number of 23s, and this is one in Wurzburg. And of course that's my buddy Doug there on the right. So it was interesting to see them there. They handle local passenger trains mostly. I never saw one on a freight train, but that's Doug there inspecting the 23. 23 is the class, 61 is the engine number. The digit on the right, I was told, was some kind of computer digit they were using at the time. I never was familiar with the depth of it, what it was. You'll notice those cars look pretty old. Those are pre-war cars. Quite a few of them were in service on local trips at the time. I rode them a number of times. They were fine. And there's a 23. Of course, you can see the freight yard over there on the right. Now, as we were standing there, a passenger train came in. The juice jack on the front was a class, was a 1935 pre-war electric. Under Hitler, they electrified some of the lines in Bavaria in the 1930s. And a few of the engines of that era are still around, mostly down in that area. And of course, the 23 again. The 110 electrics we used on passenger trains. They were, I rode behind them many a time, and that's pre-war cars on that, so that's probably a train that makes a lot of local stops. Here's another 23 pulling in a local from Lauda, which is a town southwest of Wurzburg, as you'll see shortly. But they were fun to photograph. And here you can see a freight coming in, probably from the direction of Nuremberg, with a 6-motor juice jack. Most of the juice jacks were 4-motor, but they had 6-motor ones that we used primarily on heavier freights. Freight trains in Germany were fairly short, 35 to 40 cars, so they could fit through the short blocks they had. But they were very frequent. Of course, their freight cars were a little on the ancient side back then. Well, one day, in June of 73, about a month before I came home, I went down there and decided to take a little trip down to Lauda, so I could ride behind a 23. So I did and got off, and actually the train was heading through to Heilbronn, so I got off there and took the next one back. Service was so frequent on these lines, you could do that all the time. So we used to run around in the DB all the time. We traveled mostly second class because it was cheap and easy. And of course, you never saw a German steam engine without German fans. It was like the national sport over there. And highly encouraged too. It was amazing that the whole approach toward this that I ran into over there. I couldn't believe it. And here comes the northbound train, which I eventually getting ready to hook up and head out, which I took back to Wurzburg. That thing on the left, that rail bus, they used to call them sheen buses. They had passenger service on just about every line there was over there. Even these little branch lines that you wouldn't consider over here, you'd be lucky to even see track on them, like the little lines in New Hampshire or something. And these sheen buses would run usually a motor and up to 2 trailers, sometimes as many as 2 motors and 4 trailers. They were very noisy. I don't think they're using them now, but there was a lot of them in service in those days. I think they've got newer stuff that's replaced them. And of course, we got to meet between the Heilbronn train and the train going back to Würzburg, as they say. Actions speak louder than words. So anyways, I get on the train, decide to ride back to Würzburg. Now I got a 135 lens at the Rhine-Main at the Frankfurt Audio Photo Club a couple months earlier. When I first got my Nikon, I only had the 50. I didn't even get my wide angle 79. So unfortunately, I didn't have that, but I did have my telephoto a few times. So I decided to put it to use while I was riding back to Würzburg. Of course, I had a face full of cold by the time I got back there. It was a fun ride. You could have fan trips anytime over there. You didn't have to make special arrangements. And all the local stops, these locals would stop on the way. That's the Würzburg Castle on the left. That's quite an interesting sight. Würzburg's an interesting city. It was literally firebombed into the ground in April 1945, but you never would have known it when I was there. They also have a nice little streetcar system with modern cars. Now, the following December, I decided to go down to Nuremberg because they always have a lot of Christmas celebrations in Nuremberg. So while I was down there, I happened to be walking around looking at their transit system, and I see a 50 doing some yard work. So naturally, I grabbed a shot. I might add that it's a perfect example of steam in the cold. Switching bridges. Their rapid transit line was underneath, so it was easy to get it. This is very close to walking distance where the Albert Stadium was, where they used to have their rallies. The Lenny Riefenstahl became famous. Well, then I decided to take a trip from Nuremberg and go up to Bamberg, because I was told they had double-headed Pacifics running from Bamberg to Hof. So as soon as I get into Bamberg, they take off the juice jack, and guess what's taking its place? An 01 Pacific. It was nice sitting here smelling coal smoke, I'll tell you. So off it went to Hope. So before the train to return came back, I went up and visited the cathedral. So I come back afterwards, and guess what's coming into town? Double-headed Pacifics from Hope. I was lucky to get this because they had this dieselized before the year was out. I mean, the next year. This is actually the last week of 72. Seeing the juice jack great places with the Pacifics. I never got to see I-5s replacing juice jacks at New Haven, but I get a pretty good idea from watching this what it was like. Now, this happened to take when I was down in Mannheim one day chasing the transit system. I just stood there and this comes rolling by. I learned a lesson very early in the game over there. Have your camera ready at all times because these will come rolling by out of nowhere. And that's exactly what you see here. Or standing on a bridge and it just happens to come underneath. I didn't know it was there till I suddenly smelled coal smoke and it wasn't very noisy, and here it was. So actually, I grabbed a shot. I learned that too when you're riding the train over there, have your camera out because you'd see something fast and just enough time to pull down the upper part of the window and aim out the window. Or going by shops or something, you know. This is going by the yard in Mannheim. Now, Heidelberg was another place we used to visit. It had a nice little traction system. It has a famous castle where they have a fireworks explosion every month to symbolize the burning of the castle, and a tunnel underneath the castle where the railroad goes, and a lot of locals, including some of them pulled by 23s. So I'm standing next to the yard, and sure enough, here comes a 23 and a local. And a through passenger train goes by it. This is the other end of the tunnel. The castle is right to the right up above. I was standing there at the streetcar stop when this went by, so I grabbed a quickie. This is Heidelberg Hop and Hop the following January, when we were down there again. 23 on the platform. There's Doug. That was the last trip we took together. He went back home to Ohio shortly after that. Okay.
So while Larry is changing carousels, let's see who put his comment up. Dale Schultz posted a comment that European trains are limited to 250 axles because the axle counters had a limit of 256. So little piece of trivia there. Thank you, Dale.
Early computer, probably a 8 or 16-bit computer.
Yep. Okay. Larry, you ready to go with part 2?
Okay. Well, at the time I was there, I had learned shortly before I went over there. I was at Fort Benning in the fall of '71. I went down to town of Columbus one Sunday and bumped into another rail fan who was there.
Don't forget to share your screen.
Oh. We got it now?
Good.
All righty. So anyways, so we went running around Alabama and Georgia for about 2 months. And I had a great opportunity to get a lot of photos of what was going on down there at the time, when it was still Seaboard Coastline and L&N and GM&O and all the good stuff. And in fact, 2 of the pictures I took were in classic trains a few years ago. The former New York Central E7 that was pulling an Amtrak train into Birmingham was the one, that 4029, that was on all the Ed Nowak color shots when they introduced the post-war century. So I made for an interesting end to what had been a very difficult year for me in the Army. So when I went over to Germany a month later, and that was a stroke of luck because they were cutting the size of the Army. Nixon was Vietnamizing full speed ahead, and the U.S. Army would pull it out. And Congress mandated they reduce the manpower, and to speed up the process, they let guys in Germany apply for transfer to reserve units if they had 18 months in, and they started doing it by the score. So anybody left in the States was on a trip to Germany like me. Well, turned out to be a fun party. Well, not entirely, but pretty close to it. Well, anyways, when I was going with Fred Burton, he gave me a copy of Railroad magazine in June of '70, which had a big article on German steam, and that was very useful for some of these trips. And the biggest place at that time was the Moselle Valley between Koblenz and Trier, as I will show you. Now, if you look at the map, you can see Koblenz up toward the top there, where the Moselle River comes into the Rhine. And the line down to Trier, and you'll notice it doesn't have the electrification marks, the little lines coming out of where the main line is. And there's a rather interesting reason for that. I found out from a book I borrowed in the GI library called Railway Holiday in Bavaria. In the 1950s, when the railroad wanted to electrify the line there, the local states fought to get the river made more navigable. So all the money went into that and they didn't electrify. So the DB said, okay, if that's what you'll think of us, we'll give all our steam engines. Well, that may have not made some people happy, but it sure made us rail fans happy. So the line from Koblenz to Trier became the shooting gallery. And we couldn't resist. And we sure had fun. And it was just in time too, because as you will see, they were putting up the wires at the time we were there. So I went over there. First, we went up to Koblenz in May of '72 and got a brief look. And then on Labor Day weekend, we spent the whole weekend in the Moselle Valley, as you will see. We'll start at Koblenz, and of course, the first thing I see over there is a 23 on a local. That was the first German steam engine I saw, by the way. Those cars that it's pulling were typical of your local and commuter cars at the time. They were fairly new. I rode them all the time. They were fine. Now, on Monday afternoon, when we came back to go back to Frankfurt, it was weekday rush hours, so that made it all the more interesting. So Koblenz was a bit of a busy place. So on the left, you have the local to Limberg. We'll see that in a little bit. And on the right, you have the one to Trier. And here's the one to Limberg. And it highballed first, making a head to the right and across the Rhine and down the Lahn Valley. And then the one to Trier departed. Now, Koblenz had an interesting roundhouse. That afternoon, we got fairly close and took a look at it. And there was, of course, plenty of 50s hanging around. When we rode down to Trier on Saturday, as we left town, I noticed another deadline, unfortunately, but you know, it was happening. I was told those curbside tenders were particularly useful on the Russian front, which was more arid. And when we were down by the roundhouse, we saw a couple of 44s. They were the heaviest decapods they had, backing in to pick up a bunch of coal cars. I think they were actually empties because the coal area was down in the Saar area, down the other end. But it was fascinating to see two of them hook up and clean their cylinders and all the noises and all the nice coal smoke to breathe in. I didn't have my wide angle or telephoto that weekend before I got them, but I did all right with the 50, I guess. I just wish I was shooting 4K video back in those days like I am now. Thanks to the fun I could have had with that. This is at Koblenz-Gondorf. Kevin Farrell had told me it was a good place as you head down toward Trier. And as you can see, the wires were pretty well up in this area. This is in May. So we just rode down there and just stood around. And it was pouring rain but we were standing under the station when this 44 comes through with a nice load. Now, on Saturday, September 2nd, when we went down to Trier, we stopped at Kokum. We asked where the tunnel was. Now, the Kokum tunnel is the longest tunnel in Germany. It's half the length of the Huzak. So we wanted to make sure we got to see what was going on there. So we got off, and of course, while we were standing there, we didn't have to wait long. Guess what shows up? Of course, we had lunch too, so made life interesting. The Kokum Castle, by the way, is at the top of that mountain on the right. They must have had fun building that in those days. But nice shot of a 52, you know, steaming away. And of course, you always have a German fan where there's a German steam engine. Like I say, it's a national sport. So we walked down to the entrance of the Kokum Tunnel to see what was going on. What do we see but a wire trains there? It's kind of weird when you think about it, because when the diesels came, they took the wires out of the Huzak Tunnel. Well, yeah, they're putting them in the Kokum Tunnel. And one of the things they're getting rid of is the diesels. Of course, the first thing that shows up is a diesel. Disappointing, but you know, what can you do? But then what comes the other way? Well, what do you know? Nothing like a 44 to brighten your day. That's Doug there. And you know, I noticed most of the crews on the steam engines were young guys, and they seem to be enjoying themselves to the hilt. I think these were very preferred assignments. And even had a helper. This was a helper for some operation. And of course, we had a diesel heading the other way. A lot of these diesels I heard later ended up in Saudi Arabia. I don't know if that's true or not. But. Now, the next train coming toward Koblenz, we were disappointed for a second. They said, oh, gee, but then wait a minute, guess what? It's only a helper. The good stuff was behind it. Must have been fun watching juice jacks pulling steam mountains through the Huzak Tunnel. Too bad I have to look at videos to see it. I could make some comments about the Huzak Tunnel from a personal perspective. Maybe I better not talk about that yet. Well, when we were on our way to Trier, we noticed going over the Moselle River, this high bridge at Bolay. So I said, uh-oh, we got to go here. So on the way back on Monday, we did just that. We got out and sat here for 3 hours. Well, we sat here and we sat here and we sat here. And the first thing that comes over is this, oh, big deal. And the next thing comes over is this. So we were just about to leave and we heard a certain screeching sound. Guess what? I think that was a 44. There was a picture in Trains magazine back in the 70s by Carl Zimmerman taken here too. This was a favorite spot. It's easy to see why. So we were sure happy to get that, I'll tell you. Well, back on our way to Trier, and of course, like I said before, always have your camera ready and be ready to open the window at a moment's notice. And of course, just going by the station, there's a helper just sitting there. Click, click, click. And as we get near Pfalzel, which, you know, Pfalzel is just before you cross the river to go into Trier. It's where the yard is and the engine storage area. Just as we approach that area, we see this. The next thing we saw, I couldn't have believed if I hadn't seen it myself. And they're all live. Boy, were we smelling coal smoke that afternoon. This actually was taken the next day. We got into town Saturday late in the day and quartered up in Trier. And Sunday morning, we get on the local bus because they don't have any trams in Trier. It's too small a city. And we came over here and spent a while doing, guess what? And a 44 come ready to go into service. Notice the turntable and all those nice active steam engines. And the bridge across the river is there. And we happen to see this 23 coming from the passenger station in Trier heading toward to the roundhouse, running light. By the way, every railroad bridge in Germany I saw has a footpath next to it. So it makes the photography a lot easier. Very easy, as you can see here. That's the Pfalzel station on the left and the yard is to the right. So we just walked along, never had to go into any protected area, just shoot out to heart's content. 23 and a 44 just sitting here all ready for action. And like I say, that little cement block, it's obvious what that is. That's about to be a catenary tower. So as you can see, we were very tight on our time with getting here. Like I say, my only regret is I didn't shoot 4K videos back then. I could have had the day of my life doing this over here then. Oh. Nice 44 with a Betty Coltrane. And another one coming from town into the yard. And this is Sunday. Imagine what weekdays are like. Now, you notice the sign there on the right. Unfortunately, it was a weekend. That's where they had the rail visiting hours posted. Really? What an attitude, huh? But we just walked around and shot everything we could see. Car shops, baby. Or engines just sitting there smoking away. Of course, it's kind of a scary thought how many of these we use for human cargoes. My wife, who's sitting next to me, her father, by the way, was a POW in the Battle of Bulge. He got to know this area a little different than I did.
POW MIA.
Yeah. This is the German Bud car of the time. This is what actually took us back to Koblenz on Monday. But, you know, you just walk around the roundhouse where it was able to walk and just shoot away. Trier, by the way, is famous for a couple things. It has the Porta Nigra, the famous Roman gate. It's also the birthplace of Karl Marx. And we visited that too, and I swear it's the only house I ever saw where everybody in that area who owned dogs must have had a favorite walking spot. So we walked around the yard. Of course, there's plenty of steam. Some diesels, but the diesels were very much in the minority because it wasn't the diesels that were replacing these, it was the juice jacks. The more recently shot ones all had the red stripe along the running board. I just kept shooting and shooting. I mean, when you see this, you can't help it, you know what I mean? I don't know how many films I went through. Kodachrome did good business there that day. I knew Nikon got plenty of exercise. Because this was all mostly Kodachrome too, some Ektachrome. And of course, you see the water tower. And that's Trier Hop and Hop on Saturday night. I borrowed my buddy's tripod for that one. Well, we decided Monday morning when we went back to Koblenz, we'd stop first and see morning rush hours at Trier Station, and we weren't disappointed. Here comes the 23 in with a local. We cut off. Of course, I was too young to see the rush hours at North Station when all the good stuff was going on, although I was alive then. So this kind of made up for it. And a 50 comes into town with some more older cars. '51, slightly modified, and machine buses. And everybody commuting by train, run by steam engines.
What year was this?
72. Now, this was taken later when I was riding through Cologne. And as I said before, I learned early in the game, have your camera ready. And I had my 135 lens on when I saw this, and I just pulled the window down, took it out the window. This is Dusseldorf Hauptbahnhof, and there's another one heading through in the distance. You can see some sheen buses. This was the following winter. I was up there shooting traction, but you didn't have to look for steam. It found you. Another out the window shot. I think this is an Aachen. Okay. I'll move on to my next one.
And while Larry changes his carousel tray again, and Larry, don't forget to start sharing again. Just a reminder to folks that all the folks attending on the webinar, you can chat text messages to the group by using the chat thing down at the bottom of your screen.
Well, now we're going up to Bebra. One of the things I learned when I was looking at the relevant magazine article Fred Burton gave me was about the Bebra on the border, because at that time, trains to Berlin were coming in. A juice jack would bring it up from Frankfurt. You see on the map here, as you go up from Frankfurt, you go up through through Hanau, and then you head north, and you go all the way up. Before you get to Kassel, you can see Bebra right there. And Bebra, basically, the East German steam engines would come across the border. They had to leave. Crews were picked so they could leave their families back in the East. You can kind of guess as to why. And would come in and pick up the train brought up from Frankfurt. So we went up there on the 23rd of July, 1972, a rather hot Saturday. And so we get into Bebra, get off, and of course the juice jack comes off and goes to the juice jack roundhouse, as you can see. Yeah, that's one of the 112 class juice jacks, painted in the high-speed colors like the 103s. They were slightly older, but they were also high-speed engines. The green ones are for local trains. That's the juice jack roundhouse. And next door is, guess what? The steam engine roundhouse, with some nice Pacifics sitting there waiting for action. Oil burning 01 New Lines Pacifics. By the way, some of these are still running an excursion service, and if you click up fan trips on YouTube, you can catch them. Because East Germany still had steam quite a while after the West did. So here comes, you know, so we just stepped there shooting away like we kind of got in the habit of doing. They also had West German diesels. Now, the following spring, in around June of 1973, the service was taken over by West German diesels. So we were very lucky to get this when we did. They were dieselizing places, and this was one of them. But in July of 72, it was still Dampfwolf country, so naturally. It's interesting the difference with an oil burner tender as opposed to the coal burners. Roucher means smoking. Niche roucher is no smoking. It's interesting watching the water up. I took this to get a close-up of the running gear.
Larry, any idea how tall those driving wheels are? They look big.
Very good question. I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up. Because East Germany had a lot of these Pacifics in passenger service. I think all their main passenger trains were still steam powered at that time. So, I'd have to research that. So we walked alongside of the right of way, just like I say, and we didn't want to go too far because there were warnings in every barracks in Germany, don't be a border incident. So this is about as far as I did to get, but just enough to, so you could see them pulling full steam. Watch them drivers roll. And they'd run light across the border and back, probably for servicing or whatever. But it was nice to be able to see them when they were. That's a Russian diesel, a Russian-made diesel. It just happened to come through where we were standing here, so I grabbed a shot of it. First time I'd ever seen a piece of Russian-made rail equipment. And of course, those are East German cars, by the way. This one's coming across the border. Interesting way that the fireman's looking out through the clear vision tender. Kind of reminded me a little bit of tank engines on the B&A, the thing the fireman looked out for. Okay, so much for Bebra.
While Larry's changing once again, just in case there was any confusion, use of the term carousel is a metaphor. All these slides are digitized, but when we were doing the run through, I basically told Larry that it's roughly analogous to when we're meeting live on, everything was on 35 millimeter slides on carousel trays. So that's why I used that term.
They were taken as slides, and I have them in tray as a fact.
Right.
Just went through.
Okay, here we go. Part 4.
Yep, this is my final section. This is Limberg, which is, like I say, being in Frankfurt, we just took the local up to Limberg because I heard there was steam and we were not disappointed. So we're standing outside taking pictures, and the guy comes out of the roundhouse, invited us in. Well, we were certainly more than happy to come. I'll tell you, a year of doing this, and it was almost disappointing to come home. Not to mention all the traction we were chasing over there too. I gave a show on that some years ago, particularly Frankfurt, Cologne, Dusseldorf, as they were then. But this is right at the time when the LRVs were being ordered. The chief engineer I got to know in Dusseldorf, Joachim von Rohr, he's the Werner von Braun of light rail. And he had nothing good to say about the Boeing cars. And I quoted it all to my neighbor at the time. His name was Dukakis. So they can't say they didn't know what was going on. But that's a story I'm not even going to get into. But anyways, here we are on the turntable. If you look to the right, you can see the steeples of the Limburg Cathedral. It was built in 1215 and had 7 steeples on it. They had battery rail cars serving this area at the time. Of course, it's all juice jacks now. But it was nice to see some steam on the turntables. I think 2 of these engines weren't active, but the rest of them were pretty busy. And they were good shape too, from the look of it. They take care of this stuff over there, or they certainly did then. The oldest equipment over there was in better shape than the newest equipment on some of the lines over here, like PCC cars or Bud cars or whatever, you know. This was fun. This was what was sitting there. I think the two on the right weren't active at the time. You could sort of sense it.
Larry, I'm just going to break in here. A couple interesting comments came in on the chat. So many Russian diesels, according to Tom Engel, had the same engine as an Alco DL109 inside. And there was a question about the size of the driving wheels. The 01 class drivers, Tom Chase says they were 200 millimeters or 78.75 inches.
Wow.
And we had a request that you speak up a little bit, Larry. So
All right.
you could...
Well, anyways, here we are in the turntable Limberg. And you can see a battery car on the right. It was apparently a tractor factory in the neighborhood, so. But a nice quiet Saturday afternoon, the 23rd of September, 1972. And finally, is my last shot. It was taken in February of 73. I was coming from Cologne to Frankfurt, and I took a local through the Westerwald instead of down the Rhine. Plus, we went through meets in different places. And as we hit a meet on a siding, this 52 comes by, so I took a shot of that. And like I say, always have your camera ready to shoot out the window. And that's it.
Great stuff, Larry.
Thank you. It's hard to believe how long ago this was. I mean, because I was stationed there and a long time ago.
Dave, you're muted.
Anyway, great program, Larry. And for those who are curious, we topped out at 87 people viewing the program. So are there any questions from the panelists and or comments? And if not, then we'll end the formal program meeting and stop the recording and invite anybody who wants to stick around and chat to stay with us. It'll take a while to admit everybody as a panelist, but I'll move along as fast as I can. And Larry's got, Charlie, go ahead.
Yeah, Larry, it looked to me, and I couldn't be clear, were they using welded rail back then?
Yes. The riding was very smooth on the system everywhere I went. I never felt any rail joints on any trips I was on. But what amazes me is looking back at it. Now, this is 1972. This is 30 years after World War II. And it's been almost 50 years of that. And yet the condition of everything I saw over there was incredible. In West Germany, unless you look for it in certain places, you never know there had been a war there.
Yeah, same experience for me when I've been in Germany. You wouldn't know there was a war, had been a war. And even in cities where they were totally devastated, they rebuilt to look like it did before the war.
Yeah, how they could do it, it fascinated me to see all this.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in Dusseldorf, and there was a shell of a building, and the facade was clearly original or similar to original, and they were basically rebuilding the inside to modern standards. But
Yeah.
the facade that you saw from the street went back prior to the Second World War. It was just phenomenal, beautiful.
Oh yeah,
But the hotel rooms, we check into a hotel and you say, oh, this is a nice rustic hotel. And inside it was like super modern.
Yeah. I was amazed, it was incredible.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, anybody got anything else? If not, I'm going to thank everybody for coming again and get out of the way. If you're not a Mass Bay member, you can see the website up there. By all means, join. Larry's got one more thing to say, I think, before we, I promised Larry he could pitch his book.
Oh yeah, right after I retired, I was thinking what my retirement project. So we decided, well, my wife was very helpful on this. I picked up this book from Kevin Farrell called By the L about the 3rd Avenue in New York, written by this guy named Lawrence Stoller. He was a phone company employee and he took pictures from all the buildings because he had access. And I said, well, we had an L in Boston. Somebody should do one here because, you got adults that don't remember it. So what I did is I wrote one called Mainline Elevated. And we had ex libris. It was a kind of an expensive proposition, so put it on. It's a photo album of the Orange Line this last year's, both Charlestown and Roxbury, and it has a particularly significant part of it because my parents met working at Ferdinand's Furniture Store next to Dudley Station in 1941. So my father went up on the roof there. At the time, they were rebuilding the station for trackless and took pictures. So I decided to do the same thing in 1969 and took scenes from the roof of Ferdinand's, showing the L in relation to Roxbury at the time. So, like the roof and places. So just to mention it casually.
And tell them where they can get it.
Well, yeah. Kevin Farrell carries it. Seashore had quite a while. I can provide copies if anybody's really interested.
If anybody's interested, send an email to trips@massbayre.org and we'll figure out how to do it. Okay, thank you very much, Larry. So I'm going to end the program now. And thank you for watching. Those of you who are on Facebook, I see a few familiar names there. And